Over the past day, Sony has faced so much scrutiny for the PlayStation 5 Pro announcement, but things don't appear to be getting any better for them because now we're finding out a former Sony executive, Chris Deering, has said that video game industry layoffs are not the result of corporate greed and suggests laid off employees go and drive an Uber or go to the beach. I have a few different things to show off, but before I get into the topic, if you enjoy the content I create, check out the links in the description, join the community in my live streams, and consider supporting through Patreon or YouTube memberships. These are the people that the mainstream media has been defending tooth and nail for years. They're so afraid to get on Sony or Microsoft's bad side that they will constantly defend these companies, saying, oh, the people at these companies are so passionate and they care so much about giving you good products, but every chance they get, these former or current employees love to prove the mainstream wrong, and that's exactly what is happening now because a former Sony executive, Chris Deering, who was the president of Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, shared that he does not believe the recent layoffs across the various video game developers are the result of corporate greed, which is so out of touch. It's insane. Corporate greed is definitely a big part of why there are so many layoffs going on. In an interview with My Perfect Console, Deering was asked, I'm sure you're aware it's been a tough year for workers in the video game industry with around 20,000 layoffs in the last year or so. I think it's fair to say there's a bit of frustration with video game execs at Microsoft, at Sony, wherever they are, who had been closing some smaller studios in order to funnel those resources into larger projects. It seems that sort of prioritizing shareholders over nourishing a creative, diverse medium. I think you probably have more understanding than most of us about some of the pressures that those decision makers are under, but I suppose how would you answer that accusation that some of these individuals are putting greed in front of creativity? That is how companies work. There are always going to be executives, CEOs, shareholders that want more money. And I don't necessarily blame them, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what a company is there for, is to make money. But on the flip side, we can see clear as day that they are putting greed in front of things like creativity. They tell developers you only have a certain amount of time to create this project, a certain amount of money, and then halfway through that project, when the teams are actually feeling confident, they shut them down and yes, do funnel them to larger projects. And look, I understand that companies like Sony and Microsoft are always chasing the next big project, but we do see studios being formed or purchased by these larger companies, and then after a couple of months or a couple of years, they break them up, they rip the budget away from them, and ultimately it leads to closure. And that has to do with Sony's and Microsoft's deciding that they no longer feel confident in these teams, and it has to do with greed. They would rather put them on the next biggest and best project. Look at something like Concord, for example. Sony bought Firewalk Studios and then put tons of developers on that project, put a lot of money into that project so that it could get finished, so that it could release this year, and it was a complete flop. And if they left those developers on the smaller projects, well, maybe they'd have those to fall back on, but instead, no, it comes back to greed, wanting to be able to make the next biggest and best thing, which is what companies should be doing. They should be focusing on making money instead of doing things like pushing narratives. But Chris Deering here is completely coping. He actually goes on to point, at other companies that are more greedy than Sony, he feels, like Nintendo, which is just hilarious. Maybe Nintendo was greedy in some ways, but they still had a great relationship with their end users. All of these companies do have a level of greed to them, but he just does not understand why people are upset with the products that they're putting out. He's completely out of touch with reality here. He goes on to say he doesn't think it's greed, though. I think it's just an over-exuberance that was kindled and fueled by the knock-on effect of the lockdowns and the supply chain restrictions that followed. I don't think it's fair to say that the resulting layoffs have been greed. They are greed, and we see the industry is being ran by extremely greedy people. Look at Sony, for example, right? Their equipment is getting more expensive and they're ripping away features from us. They just announced the PS5 Pro, which in the United States is $700. Never mind if you want the stand and the disk drive, so you're paying over $800, which is insanity. We're seeing the rising prices of equipment, like the DualSense controllers had just gone up by a few dollars, which, yeah, $5 isn't, insane, but at the same time, you need a controller to use your console, therefore, those should be cheaper, not more expensive. We also see that they're not providing backwards compatibility on devices like PSVR 2, which makes it functionally useless because there's hardly any software for it. I mean, the list goes on. And this guy isn't an exception to the rule when it comes to Sony. He is Sony. Even though he's a former executive, he encapsulates how this company's being run and represents everything that is wrong with them, putting the blame on other companies, putting the blame on everything but the people at the top of the food chain who are the most greedy. And what makes this even worse is the fact that he is not recognizing the problems at studio level. Lots of developers are getting laid off because they were working on projects filled to the brim with DEI, and gamers are actively withholding their credit cards and aren't purchasing this activism-filled slop anymore. I mean, that is a major issue right now. Look at Concord, for example. Sony bought Firewalk Studios thinking Concord was going to be the next Overwatch and it was going to make them a boatload of money, and that didn't happen. And why is that? A major reason is because it was activism slop. Is that the only reason it failed? No, the gameplay was bad, the maps were bad, the character selection wasn't good, the character design was awful, but a big reason the story was bad, a big reason why the character designs were bad, and why the gameplay was bad is because they were more focused on pushing a message rather than creating a genuinely amazing experience. But instead of just leaving it there, he talks about how he thinks it's probably very painful for the managers to let so many people go. But I don't think having skill in that area is going to be a lifetime of poverty or limitation. It's still where the action is. It's like the lockdowns, but now you're going to have to take a few, figure out how to get through it, drive an Uber or whatever, go off to find a cheap place to live, and go to the beach for a year, which is so completely ridiculous. There are some really amazing people that are legitimately good developers that are getting let go, and that sucks because to tell those people to go and drive an Uber is ridiculous. They are the reasons why, yes, we have gotten so many amazing products in the past, and this is a statement of him being completely out of touch. But to be fair, the blue-haired freaks that are more worried about narratives than good storytelling that are causing the losses, yeah, get them out of the industry. I don't care about what happens to them. I don't care. They should be going and driving Ubers, but there are some really amazing people that have been let go, and that does suck to see because I want video games to continue to be made. I want this industry to thrive. I want great products to keep coming out. But yes, unfortunately, there are a lot of activists that are still part of the industry, and unless they let all of them go, I don't see things getting massively better. I don't see every product being a win after a win after a win like they used to be. So yes, this is a very out of touch statement, but you do have to consider, I don't feel that bad for the freaks that are being let go, but there are some genuinely amazing people that do not deserve to be part of these massive waves of layoffs because they are not the ones creating activist shit. It is pathetic to see someone like this come out and say, oh, it's not because of corporate greed. Part of it is corporate greed. Look at Cyberpunk 2077. When it launched, it was so extremely broken and was laughed at. But when they fixed it with patches and released Phantom Liberty, it turned out to be a really amazing experience because they put years of effort into it. Same with No Man's Sky. If these companies just allowed their developers who were working on projects that people were excited for, and they were not trying to rip budgets away from them, and they were not breaking up teams, maybe we would see more projects launching that people did not expect to be super amazing, and if at the developer level they were not allowing the management to hire activists and they were actually hiring based on their talents and how good they were at their job versus them simply, ticking off boxes on a checklist, yeah, we'd have better products releasing. So at the end of the day, this guy is not an exception to the company. He is Sony. He may be a former exec, but he knows exactly what they're doing. He understands their mindset, and it does have to do with corporate greed. And of course, it does have to do with DEI. And he's suggesting to the laid off employees they go and drive an Uber or go to the beach, which is totally and completely disgusting. But that's all that I really had to discuss in this video. Let everyone know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this, give it a like, and if you didn't, give it a dislike. I appreciate your support either way, but I'll talk to you all again in the next video really soon.